Excuse me. We're going to actually move into our keynote speaker soon. So first of all, I'd kind of like to thank the Tower Center, Professor Hollifield, Professor Rovner, and everyone else who's kind of allowed the Student Forum to really hold these events and kind of really bring professionals and academics to the students and really allow this kind of discourse to happen. Professor Rovner will be moderating this event tonight, and our guest speaker, Professor Barany, is, well, he's got quite the resume here, but he's a very distinguished man from UT, and he is the Frank C. Erwin Jr. Centennial Professor of Government, and it's a distinguished chair, and he'll be speaking really about why the Arab Spring became the Arab Winter. There was a lot of optimism about this, and now it seems like all that optimism is very pessimistic. There really hasn't been a lot of good things to come out of this. So really, I'd just like to thank Rafin for leading the Student Forum and really kind of allowing us to hold these events. Schmedding, Thomas, really helping with this. He did a lot of the work, probably more so than any of us on the Student Forum. And Matthew, our workers, and June, and Louisa. So thank you all for allowing us, Student Forum, to really hold these events, something that not many schools can do. So thank you again, Professor Rovner.
Well, great. Thanks for coming. The finals are close. Papers are due. Finals are close. Papers are due. So thanks for taking a slight study break. It'll be worth your while, I promise. Our speaker tonight is terrific. As you heard, is Professor Zoltan Barany, distinguished professor from UT Austin, where he's taught, I believe, since 1991. Been in Austin for a long time, but before that, he had a number of other very interesting positions, a wide range of experiences. Employers as diverse as the U.S. Army, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and Radio Free Europe. Right? So he's had a very interesting background, and if you get the chance to talk to him, you might want to ask about those things. One of the things that we stress in the Tower Center, there are a lot of jobs out there. It's not just graduating here and going to law school and being a lawyer. There's a lot of opportunities. So if you're interested in international affairs and public policy, keep your eyes and ears open, because there's a lot of things to do. As a scholar, Professor Zoltani has written a number of books on an equally wide range of subjects, including everything from military politics, military sociology, to the process of democratization, the institution of the monarchy. And most recently, what he's currently working on is the effect of political revolutions, what happens after they begin in places in far-flung regions, including North Africa and the Middle East, the ongoing revolutions which began in 2011, the revolutions we used to call the Arab Spring, and now we might be calling the Arab Winter. And with that, I will leave it to Professor Zoltani, who will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll throw it open to Q&A.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me, guys. The ones who walked me here. I understand that they partly invited me, at least because you're familiar with my wife, and I must say that I'm far less pretty, far less smart, and far less entertaining than she is. But I will do my best, so not to disappoint you. So again, I've been in Austin for 23 years, and this is my first time at SMU, which I've been to, I think, pretty much all of the major universities in Texas, but this is the first time, so thank you for that too. So I want to make 4 points, and the first one deals with Iraq, the second with democracy, the third with monarchies, and finally the fourth is with armies, arguably the subject that I really do know a little bit about. And I want to go back in history a little bit when I start with Iraq, because I really believe that historical context is very important. And I just want to mention the date, May 23rd, 2003, that most of you students were probably in elementary school at that time, but some of us, like Ambassador Jordan, will remember this. This is when the America's Coalition Provisional Authority disbanded the entire Iraqi army of 425,000 uniformed soldiers and officers. 350,000 of these were members of the Iraqi army, and about 75,000 were members of the Republican Guard. And this was done by a civilian administrator by the name of Paul Bremer. And it was done even though his direct predecessor, General J. Garner, and others were already in talks with high-ranking Iraqi officers about the best way to reconstitute the army of Iraq after the military operations were over. So the Iraqi military, of course, we didn't like it very much, but it was a conscript army. That is, people really didn't have a chance or choice of being in it or not being in it. A large proportion of them were Shia Muslim draftees, mostly Sunni officers, and they enjoyed considerable sympathy and respect around Iraq. The Order Number 2 created essentially an alarming public security and safety vacuum. It produced a large pool of trained, armed, humiliated, and desperate men for whom joining the anti-American insurgency was the most logical choice imaginable, and destroyed the only national institution in a deeply divided society, and an institution that could have actively participated in our rebuilding efforts of Iraq. This measure or step has been variously described as one of the greatest errors in the history of American warfare. Then former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich called Bremer the largest single disaster in American foreign policy in modern times. That's a direct quote. Garner did tell Bremer, by the way, that you can get rid of an army in one day. This is also a direct quote. You can get rid of an army in one day, but it takes years to build one. Bremer didn't listen to him, although he had zero knowledge or expertise about military affairs or anything like this. This quote is, by the way, from Bob Woodward's book, State of Denial. So we spent in the following 10 years over $25 billion on the Iraqi army, and you can see if you read the news how much bang did we get for our buck. So many of the people, by the way, of course, had nothing to lose and joined the fight against the West, easily radicalized, and now many of them are the leaders of the fight of ISIS, whom you also are, I'm sure, familiar with, including 3 of its top leaders. Its supreme leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is a terrorist warlord from the Iraqi city of Samarra, but 3 of his main deputies were all officers in the Iraqi army in 2003. So I thought that it would be useful to have a little reality check and remember what this, how much and how disastrous consequences you can have with one, single order. And I really think it's hard to overestimate the disaster that it has wrought, not only to the Middle East, but also to the American military. Okay, so on that happy note, I'm Hungarian, so pessimism is really, where I start and end. They say in Budapest that yesterday was better than today, but today is worse than tomorrow. So anyway, I thought I should put that in somewhere. Okay, now democracy. So I'm really interested because I'm so impressed with the 3 fellows, not just for selecting me, and again, thanks, but also for doing this whole thing. So I'm actually much more interested in your questions than in what I have to say. But I will do my job, I promise. So, democracy, the second point. There was great hope for democracy. In 2011, February, March, and April, and then this hope kind of went south. This hope was, in my view, entirely unreasonable and based on very unreasonable and spurious grounds. So, why? Let me go back a little bit in history, not too much. So, the Arab world, 350 million people, right, have miserably failed to create democracy or happiness for most of its subjects. Why? So this is a very important question, why this has been so, why has been there no democracy? And actually this was, I'm not a Middle Eastern studies scholar or expert, but I know enough about the field to know that this was basically a little sort of sideline that a lot of people wrote articles and books about why. What is it about Arabs that they cannot create democracy? Well, obviously no one suggested that Arabs as a people lack talent or suffer from some sort of a pathological antipathy to democracy. After all, there are plenty of Arabs in America and elsewhere who have done extremely well, including in politics, and I could come up with a lot of Arab Americans who've been successful governors and so on and so forth. So what is the situation? Why is it so seemingly so difficult for Arabs or the Arab world to generate workable democracies? Well, basically, there are many answers and far more sophisticated than really books have been written on this, but basically what we have are weak states from the get-go, weak economies, weak civil societies, and opposition movements, but we have strong regimes, right? We all know the difference between states and regimes. So, a few words about religious extremism, which is a conduit for misery, but not a fundamental cause of misery. Islam has not always been, by the way, associated with radicalism. If you're a historian and familiar with the history of Ottoman Empire, and I actually did some work on that a long time ago, you find out that the Ottoman Empire was far more tolerant, especially in terms of religious tolerance, than next door the Habsburg Empire. Far more so. Nobody was forcibly converting anyone in the Ottoman Empire. If you paid your taxes, your religious taxes, and of course Catholics and Christians were supposed to pay a little higher taxes than the Muslims, but that was it. Now you go over to the Habsburg Empire, where I hail from, and if you were not a Catholic under Maria Theresa or Joseph II, 1780 to 1790, Maria Theresa's son, I remember that still. Anyway, then you would either be tortured or you converted, because you realize the error of your ways of being a Protestant, God forbid, or even a Jew. Remember that the Ottoman Empire, by the way, took boatloads, and I mean literally boatloads of Jews from Spain, who were persecuted in Spain. And the Jewish contingent became one of the most important generator of commerce and art and so on and so forth. Anyway, so the point is, this hasn't always been that way. It doesn't have to be always that way. In fact, until very recently, in Iraq and Syria, plenty of Shia and Sunnis married each other. So it's not something that has lasted for a long time. But the violent perversion of Islam in the last 30, 40 years has spread to many places, and places as far as Nigeria, as we hear about in the news every day almost, and the northern UK. So the modern spread of Islamism is an explicit political expression of Islamic thought that has created obviously many problems, and claims that the founding texts of Islam are open to widely varying interpretations also tend to cause serious trouble. Of course, not fundamentalist Islam is not that much different from fundamentalist Christianity. Just so far happens to be a little more violent. Now, second point here is the absence of a liberal state matched by the absence of a liberal economy, which is very important because after independence, mostly the 40s and 50s, for most of the Arab republics, that is, I'm not talking about monarchies just yet, the prevailing orthodoxy was economic central planning, right? The Soviet type of Soviet-inspired central planning, which resulted in anti-market, anti-trade, pro-subsidies, pro-regulations, and basically these new Arab governments, after they left the colonial yoke, basically they strangled their own economies. The state pulled the levers of economic power, especially in places where there was oil, and where the constraints of post-socialism were lifted, the capitalism of the crony rent-seeking type took hold, as it did in the later years, for instance, in Egypt. The Egypt of Hosni Mubarak, for instance. But I actually think that if you think about Syria and Tunisia and so on, they are all similar states to, these crony capitalist states to, which I think one good example, non-Arab example, is Russia today. So, privatization, to the extent that it happened, was for the pals of the government, and the government's control of resources. And this is really the key point from a political standpoint, that the government's control of resources really, and I mean oil by resources mostly, obviated any need for the rulers to gain the consent of the ruled. They didn't have to, right? They had it all. So virtually no markets were free. There were barely any world-class companies that were developed in the Arab world. And essentially clever Arabs who wanted to succeed went to North America and Western Europe. So this economic stagnation, in turn, had an enormous effect because it created dissatisfaction, societal dissatisfaction, and basically the monarchs and the presidents for life, because all of these presidents that were thrown over in 2011 were presidents for life. They defended themselves with secret police and goons and so on and so forth. So in this kind of situation where there is no political space for opposition or anything, we're getting back to religion, because the mosques became the source of public services and one of the few places where people could discuss politics and could gather to hear speeches. So Islam was radicalized, and the angry men who loathed their rulers came to hate the Western states that backed those very same rulers. So meanwhile, a vast number of young men grew restless and unemployed, because particularly from the richer countries, these young men were able to go to school and gain degrees, but there was no place for them to work. And so, for instance, if you're an expert on Moroccan politics, you know that there's a political party that's called the Party of Unemployed Graduates. These are people, young men, basically 25 to 40, who have never worked, even though they have degrees, because the economies weren't able to provide them any kind of job. So those who didn't have the resources and the circumstances that allowed them to emigrate, they are there being very unhappy and having very little to lose, which is, as anyone will tell you, young men with nothing to lose. It's not something you want. Yeah, so it's something you don't want at all. Anyway, so, but thanks to the electronic media, and Louisa knows that I know nothing about electronic media, but I know it being discussed. Yeah, so because I still have this that my wife, whom you're so fond of, made me buy 8 years ago, and I used it for 15 times. But anyway, I am aware that there is such a concept of electronic media. So these people took to the streets, and these people found out from the electronic media that their cohort elsewhere in the world actually had better prospects than they did. And of course, they didn't really want to hear this. The last point I want to make about the past is demography, right? And demography, not just of this bulge of young men, demographic bulge, which is really an incredibly important issue in Middle Eastern politics, but also the tremendous migration to the cities, to the large cities. I was just in Cairo. It's just stupefying. 20 million people, but I was told when I said to my guide, 20 million people. So, well, during the day it's 25 million people, right? Seriously, like 5 million more. That's probably the population, I don't even know, Dallas, how many, like the Metroplex or something. Anyway, just come in every day to work because there are no other possibilities. It's really incredible. So these millions of displaced peasants come with very different kind of values, cultural ideas, and religious loyalties, and they find it often very difficult to cope with urban life. So, what happened since 2011? So, since 2011, basically, a depressing region-wide reversal of hopes. The hopes that, as I said, I don't think that they were really justified. The voices calling for sweeping liberal reforms, which is basically what the region needs, might have pulled the Arab countries into in line with the rest of the world, but these voices turned out to be extremely weak or divided or easily paid off, as in Morocco and Jordan, or easily intimidated, as in Egypt and Syria. Well, I shouldn't say easily intimidated. When your family is harmed or you're harmed, it's not that easy. I mean, anybody would be intimidated. Anyway, the point is, a lot of people are talking about regime change, and I'm not a big sort of political science theorist, but we need to know what regimes are. There has been no regime change anywhere. There has been a change of elites. That is one group of thugs kicked out the other group of thugs. The only place where there's regime change is Tunisia, right? That's the only place. And even there, a lot of the old stalwarts of the regime are slowly coming back. So other than Tunisia, it's really what happened was either a reprise of the ancien regime, the old regime, or as in Egypt, the new president comes in who is another dictator that quite possibly worse than the one he replaced, or there is civil war. And civil war of different kinds of intensity, because a lot of people, depending on how they define civil war, could easily say that Libya is in civil war right now because of the rival militias. Yemen is in civil war. Obviously, Syria is the most intense, the most acute. But what do you have left then? You have, so these are three of the countries. Then Tunisia we have some hope for. Egypt is a dictatorship, and Bahrain nothing happens. It's an absolute monarchy, right? So, sorry, I mean, I could get into a lot of details, and if you ask me, I will, because I've been actually going a lot to these places. But I was just in Egypt a few weeks ago, and gave some talks, and where they told me what not to talk about, by the way. So I was in Bahrain and Burma before. This Freddy will tell you about my trip around the world. But anyway, neither in Burma nor in Bahrain, which is, and Ambassador Jordan knows all about Bahrain, across the King Fahd Causeway from Saudi, right? Nobody told me what to talk about. In Egypt, I was told, please do not say blah, blah, blah. Do not talk about that. Whatever you do, don't talk about Egypt. And this was at the American University of Cairo, which is by far the most liberals and so on, because there are always plans. And by under Mubarak, academics, unless they were calling for his dismissal openly, they were, he might not have, these academics might not have gotten, state grants, but they were not put into jail. Now they are. This is a year after Mr. Sisi is in. So, extensive security presence everywhere. I went to Cairo because I was able to fool my wife into saying that it was very safe. It's not safe at all, but I didn't talk too much about that. The dissent is clamped down in whatever form it might appear, including in universities. Basically what happens is that a weak state but a strong regime confronts a weak civil society. And the Egyptian bureaucracy, of course, is basically, it's maybe not exactly the same people, but they act exactly the same way. And if you follow the news, you know that not just Mubarak, but all of his two sons and so on were all acquitted of any crimes in the last week. Now, Iraq and Syria, of course, the epic, ongoing, and increasingly interlinked tragedies. The combined death toll, and you probably all know this now, 350,000 people among the two countries, between the two countries, 30 million at least refugees, archaeological cities. This is not just them, it's the entire world, cultural heritage, right? It's us. You will never be able to go see these places, or your children, because they are destroyed. Of course, Syria is supported by Russia and Iran, and these wars empowered radical Sunni jihadists like those of ISIS vicious and far more ambitious stepchild of Al-Qaeda than where it actually came from, that in June 2014 proclaimed the territory a caliphate. Now, both Libya and Yemen, they're very similar in many ways, and the most important thing that you might want to remember them about is the tremendous role of tribes and regions, right? Which in Tunisia and Egypt is not nearly that important. But this is one of the reasons for all these multiplying militias that are taking control of certain parts of the country. It is all going by regions and what tribe you belong to. As far as Yemen is concerned, of course in Libya the old dictator is gone, obviously, but in Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was the president before, he's still very active. He's still the head of his old historical party. And in terms of regime change, well, guess who is the president? His former vice president. So I mean, it's hard to make a case for any kind of serious transformative change at all. And the economy of Yemen is basically reliant on handouts from the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and particularly Saudi Arabia next door, which of course has to say an existential interest might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but they very much want to keep things under control, and they haven't really succeeded. Now, Tunisia is the success story. The one success story it happens also to be the smallest by population of any of these countries. It seems to have truly cast off its old ways and embraced a new, more open political order. So why is Tunisia so different, right? This is the question. What happens in Tunisia that didn't happen elsewhere? Well, there are some... one of the most important things, but maybe I'm saying this because I tend to regard myself as more than anything as a military specialist, is that it had a very weak army. All of these other places had very strong armies that were intimately connected to the ruling elites. And in Tunisia, that was exactly the opposite. The army was very small. It was marginalized because the security and police forces were favored. It also, I think all of the Tunisian officer corps had extensive exposure to Western military institutions like the War College, and both in Western Europe and the United States and Canada. I was able to extensively interview quite a few Tunisian officers who all suggested that this kind of education made a difference in how they viewed the world and politics in general, and the role of armies in politics. But I'm a little bit skeptical about how useful these coups are. I think far more important is the fact that the Tunisian army had I think it may be the only African army that it had absolutely no history of political involvement ever. Not once did they, try to influence political outcomes. And why is that, you would say? Well, the founding president of Tunisia, by the name of Bourguiba, he was an intellectual, and he instinctively, like a lot of post-colonial intellectuals from Nyerere in Ghana, in Tanzania, to Nkrumah in Ghana, instinctively distrusted the military. And he wanted the military not only to be marginalized, but he was, I think, the only Arab state where the military was not even able to vote, let alone be involved in politics. They didn't even have the right to vote if you were a member of the armed forces. So with this kind of background and this total lack of history, I think it made a huge difference in how they viewed politics in general. Now, of course, Tunisia had a very corrupt rule, just like the others, real crony capitalism, but the rule was somewhat less brutal than elsewhere. And the reason why is that, first of all, if you look at the map, Tunisia is like 150 miles from, maybe even less, from Sicily. So it's a lot more exposed to the West. It was a lot easier for people to go to France and so on. and but had a much better organized civil society, much higher levels of political participation and public participation by women. So when I went there, just as an anecdote, I was there in 2011 December, and I was accompanied by a young woman who was a PhD student, finishing her PhD at the Sorbonne on Arab military politics. Anyway, and she asked me if I wanted to go to demonstration right in front of the parliament. Of course I want to go to a demonstration right in front of the parliament. So she pointed out to me women who were wailed. And this was so unusual in December 2011. She said this could have never happened under Ben Ali because women were not allowed to cover themselves at all, which of course is wrong, obviously, in an Islamic country. But it was how secular this society was is really hard to imagine. And another thing which really made an impression on me, not only were women allowed to work, Saudi Arabia, right? You all think about that. But they had exactly the same pay scale as men on the same level. So yeah. So I mean, I actually asked her because she was an instructor in the Department of Politics at the University of Tunis, and I said, "How do you know that?" And she says, "It's all public record, just like University of Texas's salary, right? Your upset colleagues can figure out how much you make just by Googling your name and salary, and it's the same." So anyway, it was far more open and. Yeah, of course there was corruption and brutality and so on and so forth, but in many ways it was a much more open and transparent society than the others. So basically, but even in Tunisia, if you read the newspapers, you know that Tunisia per person or on a proportional basis had quote unquote given more of the ISIS fighters than any other country, right? 3,000 Tunisian young men are fighting with ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And so why is that? You would think, we have this country that seems relatively liberal. And actually there's a very, very reasonable, logical answer. So under Ben Ali, the former dictator, right, most of the Islamists were either in exile or they were in jail, right? Especially the ones that the fear was that they might be radical. So the first free elections were won by Ennahda, which is a moderate Islamist party, right? And so what they did, they let all the criminals and all the radical Islamists out of jail. So they're all of a sudden right in society now. That's on the one hand. So a lot of these people just immediately went off down to Libya and then off to Syria. And another reason for this is that although the military pretty much remained intact after the Arab Spring, the security and intelligence organization were dismantled because, as I mentioned, these were the ones that the dictator relied on. And so basically, Tunisia had no capacity to monitor, let alone to apprehend, the radical Islamists. And so this is really the security problem, and I've been working a lot on defense reform and security sector reform in these countries. And Tunisia has absolutely no problem with its army because, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, except that it needs a lot of stuff in order to be able to secure their border. But the problem is in the intelligence and police apparatus, which obviously is very much needed, and they are missing. So basically, to finish with the democracy idea, except for Tunisia, the Middle East and North Africa was much, much better off 4 years ago than it is today. There's no question. And I know that hindsight is 20/20, but I don't think it was that difficult to foresee that this was about to happen. If you knew these countries reasonably well. Now, monarchies. So, what about these monarchies? We have 8 of them in the Arab world, right? And they are remarkably resilient. So, what is it about these monarchies that they prove so resilient to nobody even wants to overthrow them, seemingly, right? Except for Bahrain, all the Shia. So the last Arab monarchs fell in the 1950s and early 60s. Mm-hmm. The only Middle Eastern monarchy that fell since then, there was only one, and it was in 1979, and that was, of course, the Shah of Iran, but he was not an Arab, right? So, what's the deal? Why? So we have 8 monarchies, and I'm sure you all know, but just to refresh your memory, there are two sort of poor ones, right? Morocco and Jordan. And then there are 6 rich ones. And some of them are filthy rich, like literally filthy rich, like Qatar and UAE. And then pretty rich, like still pretty rich, in spite of all the mismanagement or the lack of diversifying economies, like Saudi and Bahrain. And there are, and Kuwait is still, and then Oman, which if you ever go to the Middle East for tourism purposes, that's where I think you should go. It's a beautiful country with verdant hills and great hiking and so on. You would never believe that you're in Oman, let alone that you're 5 miles from the Yemeni border. Anyway, so what happened here? So there was no major upheaval in these countries, in the UAE and Qatar at all, and somewhat more in Saudi, especially in the eastern province, which is where the Shia live, and or the majority of the Shia population live. Some more in Oman and especially in Kuwait. The Kuwait is the only Gulf monarchy where there is actually meaningful parliament and legislature and so on. It still has some problems because the parliament can be disbanded at the will of the prime minister, who is a royal appointee, but still there is actually some legislative development there that's worthy of our attention. Now, Bahrain is very, very different, right? Bahrain is a tiny island in the Persian Gulf, or as our Arab friends like to say, the Arabian Gulf. And it is very close. In fact, I think that the King Fahd causeway is like 15 miles or something like that to the Saudi mainland. Now, Bahrain, and Ambassador Jordan will correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost entirely controlled by the Saudis. So it has very little oil left. But Bahrain, it's a really interesting place. I've been going there because it's so interesting. It's basically a safety valve for the Saudis. So all those Saudis who live under extremely difficult conditions, no alcohol, no misbehaving, no women driving, no and so on. They don't even, guess what? I just found this out from some Bahraini friends last month. There are not even changing rooms in Saudi, for women's clothing shops and so on. So basically, what a lot of people do for weekends and so on, they go over to Bahrain for drinking and whoring and shopping. Literally. I mean, I know. I mean, maybe it's a dinner speech. So, and you're all over 18. That's what's happening. I stayed in this really fancy hotel a couple of years ago when I stayed there, and the hotel was a big Islamic holiday. 85% of the guests were from Saudi, and 40% of their guests were Ukrainian and Moldovan whores. I'm serious. Yeah, it's true. So it's really worthwhile for the Saudis to keep Bahrain the way it is because it's a safety valve. Imagine if all those hormones and all those people who want to be drunk, they would be in Saudi Arabia. This would be a chaos, right? And all the Salafists and the Wahhabi imams would be really upset. And this way, things are a little more better. Anyway, what's different about Bahrain is that at least 65% of the population are Shia Muslims, right? All of the 8 ruling monarchs are Sunni Muslims, right? With the exception of the Omani, Oman's ruler, because Oman is Ibadism, which is a different kind of religion, but it's pretty close to Sunni, right? So the problem in Bahrain is this rather pesky majority of Shia Muslims who tend to be relatively well organized, and just recently they had an election on November 22nd, and they decided they boycotted the election because they figured that this Al-Wefaq is the name of the party, that if they had joined, then they would lose all their credibility among their constituents, particularly the younger constituents. Now, in Morocco and so in Bahrain, there were major demonstrations, and some people died, and the security forces were involved. Not only the security forces, but also the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, that all six belong to, actually sent some troops from Saudi and the UAE policemen, and they made sure that that it was suppressed. So, what I'm really interested in, what is it about monarchies? What is it about monarchies that makes them so different? Why don't these people in Morocco or Jordan, especially the poor ones, right? I mean, I'm not super poor. I'm not trying to say it's like Honduras, but it's pretty grim if you're the majority of the population. Well, why? So several reasons. The first one is, believe it or not, there is popular support for monarchical regimes. This is popular support that actually can be demonstrated with pretty good surveys and so on and so forth. So why are they popular? First, religious authority. There is, if you're interested in the Middle East, I urge you to go to a website, and it's called the Muslim 500. And it's the 500 most influential Muslim people around the world. And the top 10 includes 4 of the monarchs, including the monarchs of Morocco and Jordan. So why them? Because they actually claim to be direct descendants of the Prophet. Now, 63rd generation later, I mean, I don't know, I can only go back, like 5, but anyway, they can. People believe it. That's the main thing, right? It doesn't matter. The people do believe it. They have a great deal of authority in terms of religion. Now, the 6 Gulf states, still, even Oman and even Bahrain, they're pretty well off by any standard. Nobody's going hungry. Nobody's, suffering from malnutrition. And even in Oman, if you work, you have pretty decent living standards, like, say, Portugal. Not like Sweden, but Portugal easily. And of course, when you go, I said that in Qatar and the UAE there was no demonstration at all. When the GDP is $178,000 a year, there's not that much to demonstrate about, right? I mean, yes, you don't have political rights, but I've always been very skeptical about how important are political rights for people, even in the West, right? I mean, I think most people are interested in stability and prosperity. And if you cannot vote and so on, well, that's not good. You'd rather vote, but you're not going to leave Qatar, or you will leave Qatar and still, use the benefits. If you're interested, I can tell you I spent some time in Qatar with some Qataris, and I understand the kind of deal they get in life. Life is unfair. So anyway, there's also the political and cultural aspects of rule in monarchies. So all of these monarchies has very long histories, right? Which we don't really know, because at least I don't really know, because it's not something that you learn in school. I mean, you just paper over the Middle East and so on, and about. But if you're a Moroccan intelligent person and you go to school, you know that this monarchy goes back 500-600 years, right? And it has incredible, mosques going back a long time, and all kinds of cultural achievements and so on. The only place that's a very young monarchy is which one? No.
Kuwait.
No. Jordan. The best anecdote is when it comes to Jordan, Winston Churchill, when they asked him about Jordan, he said that, you remember, right? That I created Jordan on a lovely afternoon in Cairo in June of 1920. And that's exactly, this is not just usual Churchillian braggadocio. This is really how it happened. So there was all this real estate and what to do with it. Now they had some warlords in Saudi who they were very pro-British, and this is the grandfather of the current king of Jordan, Abdullah. And so it's a very new country, right? Let alone kingdom. But all the others have actually pretty long histories. They have, most of them are not very large in terms of population, so you have a lot of familial and familiar networks. So a lot of basically patronship and people, you find the right people, they can get things done for you. So it's not other than Morocco and Saudi. These are relatively small countries in terms of population. And there is also one thing, royal succession, right? When all these monarchs look at the republics, where you should have orderly elections and succession and so on, they find out that it was the children of the monarchs, or I'm sorry, the children of the presidents for life, right? Mubarak, and same in Yemen, same in all the other countries. At least you have an old succession mechanism, which didn't always work perfectly, as in Saudi, but most of the time it did. And so it had a sort of stability and predictability to their lives. Also, monarchies have a structural flexibility, so when people are really upset about the government or a particular minister, the monarch just can go and, okay, you're gone, and here's the next person, right? Also, the two monarchs, namely Mohammed VI in Morocco and Abdullah in Jordan, tend to be masterful political operators. They need to be, right? Because they have so little to offer in terms of financial greasing of the wheels, which all the others, basically the other 6 monarchs can still buy social peace with money. The Saudis spent $136 billion right when the demonstrations began in the eastern province. Even lowly Bahrain, $2,700 per family. Just take it and be happy. In Oman, the ruler agreed to build 2 new public universities, because this was one of the long-standing grievances of young people, that they only had 2 universities in the whole country. So, okay, I'll build 2 new ones. Another reason why they managed to resist is because of societal cleavages, right? That the opposition, to the extent that there is any opposition at all, is quite divided. And these are sectarian, they're regional, they're ethnic to some extent. And also, one thing that you probably heard a great deal about is the number of foreigners. For instance, in Qatar, I think there are only 300,000 Qatari citizens, but there are 2.5 million people in Qatar, right? The rest of them are foreigners from Nepal and Bangladesh and other, Muslim countries. You cannot find a taxi driver in Qatar who is not Nepalese. Anyway, I can get into all this later. So shortcomings of political mobilization, because also the monarchs are very good they do have very reliable intelligence and police services and so on and so forth. And depending on how brutal the regime is, the Saudis tend to be more brutal than the others. But basically, even in Morocco and Jordan, which are more of the more even-handed ones, and if you don't like if you don't like the political situation, you can go off to France and be in exile. And half of these people who became active came down from France and Sweden and various European countries. So also there's deep divisions in the opposition between radical Islamists and more moderates, and people who are very secular. So now the state responses have been really to buy off social peace with money, as I mentioned, or carrots and sticks. Some people were jailed in Saudi and so on, and to have very limited reforms. But there are some reforms, even particularly in Morocco and Jordan, where they have to be, because they cannot cannot dole out money. But as I mentioned, even in Bahrain there were some political reforms. They are very small, but and they do not satisfy the opposition, but there was a response. Now, in terms of the future of these monarchies, they are still in a pretty enviable economic situation, and they have huge financial reserves, particularly in the case of Saudi. And Saudi is really like the older brother. If there is anything major happening in Bahrain, but even in Yemen, then the Saudis will open the purse strings and give them a few $1 billion. They gave almost $20 billion to Mubarak's Egypt after Mubarak resigned, just to keep things on an even keel. And in Jordan and Morocco, this is where you are facing the king's dilemma, right? That Samuel Huntington called it the king's dilemma in political order and in developing societies, or whatever it's called, political order and changing society. The king's dilemma is, what is the king's dilemma? That you must introduce meaningful reforms to prevent dangerous socio-political upheavals, but that very reform, of course, might lead to the collapse of the regimes. And actually, Alexis Tocqueville said something very similar, that the most dangerous point in a regime's life is when they start to think about implementing reforms, right? Anyway, in terms of Bahrain, and this is really the only country where serious demonstrations took place. I just gave a talk at this place, one of these government think tanks, and one of the people in the audience read something that I wrote for a Qatari think tank, where I called the Bahrain an authoritarian state, and she was very upset. And so I said, I didn't want to. So what do you call Bahrain? And she said, transition into democracy. And I was at that point, I was just polite enough not to say anything. Okay. So in terms of the armies, briefly now, how much time do I have, by the way? I didn't look at my
5 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay. So the military really has played a decisive role in the course of these uprisings. The military was an essential but very specific part of the Arab authoritarian regimes. In the 1950s and 60s, they acted as modernizers and state builders with a sort of a nationalist vision in all of these Arab republics. And from the 1970s up to the Arab Spring, basically, there was a very intimate nexus between the state and the military, which was really at the core of the regimes. Their role was in the uprising was pivotal, but I don't think terribly surprising. And the book that I just finished is How Armies Respond to Revolutions and Why. And my argument is that if you know enough about a country and its army and society and politics, then you can, not in all cases, but generally you can make at least at the very least an educated guess which way will things go. So I didn't think it was very surprising that the Tunisian military did not shoot at the unarmed demonstrators, right? As they didn't. In Egypt, this was much harder to say because the Egyptian army was so close to Mubarak's regime, but it was actually somewhat marginalized politically compared to the intelligence and the police apparatus, the interior ministry units. So that would have taken somewhat more to predict. In Yemen and Libya, what you had there, you didn't really have very cohesive armies. And as soon as the identity of the demonstrators was revealed, the military basically became very fragmented and fell apart, right? And people of the Houthi tribes or Houthi background went, their way to support the Houthi demonstrators, and it essentially just broke down to supporting your own tribe. And in Syria, standing by Assad of the Alawites, right, the Alawite ethnic group who basically had all the major positions in the armed forces, was not a surprise at all, especially if you know the background of the Syrian state and the Syrian armed forces. And in Bahrain, obviously, so in Bahrain what you had in terms of the military is you had a Sunni kingdom, a Sunni business class, and the Sunni armed forces. The Shia are not even let near the armed forces, right? Because you don't want to arm your potential enemy. And a lot of Sunnis, and certainly the Sunni elites, believe that as soon as you give the Shia the possibility, they will turn the country into an Iran-like theocracy. And so I just thought that was really a no-brainer. Now, in terms of what happened to these armies since then, not very much. In terms of reforms, marginal things. That, for instance, there are in Bahrain now more women are let into the armed forces, or in Yemen some of these special units that were created to safeguard the regime were melted into the army at large, and so on and so forth. So, in closing, it's basically the outlook is not good for the Arab Spring, and there is Arab Winter, or whatever you want to call it. But basically, we still have weak states and very strong regimes, and the mantra of the monarchies and the military men is basically stability, which in time of chaos is understandable, but repression and stagnation aren't really a solution, and this is what we have. I mean, what these countries need to come out of this hole that they have been in for a long time is basically very serious structural and transformative liberal reforms, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So,
thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
So we are officially up till 7 o'clock. We'll keep it open, and we'll have some Q&A. I'll take the prerogative and ask one question, and we'll throw it wide open. Very interested in your starting point and your ending point, because you started with a story about Paul Bremer disbanding the Iraqi army, and you ended on with a discussion about the role of an army as a stabilizing force. And in one sense, these are sort of consistent arguments. You can have, if you have an army in place, you can plausibly maintain some semblance of order and security. If you don't have an army in place, you've got Libya, you've got Yemen, you've got chaos, you've got disaster. But I'm trying to think what the actual options were in 2003. If you could go back in time, right? Let's say you don't disband the Iraqi army, right? Just avoid that blunder. Right? What are you left with? It seems to me that you're left with an army which has a history of incredible loyalty to a very odious regime, personal loyalty. Not a terribly competent officer corps, because the good officers had been purged and the loyalists had remained, as far as I can tell. An army which didn't have a lot of experience with Western institutions. They hadn't been to the war colleges, I promise you that.
Yep.
An army which was an instrument, at least in the officer corps and the Republican Guard, which were an instrument of repression more than of combat effectiveness. What does that army look like if we keep it together? And how do you transform that army in 2003 into anything other than a nasty instrument of repression later?
Okay. Well, I think that the first epic mistake was the war itself. So, we shouldn't have been there, and I think that virtually everybody now realizes that, this war in Iraq was possibly the biggest mistake the U.S. made in the last 100 years. Anyway, but now we're there. Yeah. So what are we doing? Well, I still think that you definitely should have kept the army together. Now, so this has been done before. The whole idea of what you do with these armies, I don't think that there's any historical precedent. I actually worked on that in the book that I published in 2012. And the whole idea of the whole Order Number 2 was the idea that spurred me to write the book, because I started to think about, has there ever been an instance when an army was just dismissed like this? And I looked at the Bolshevik army. I did a lot of work on Russia and Eastern Europe. And this is quite possibly the most repressive regime in the world when they come in 1917. And so there is the Tsarist army. They don't dismiss the Tsarist army because they know we're going to need these people. So what they do is they dismiss the most horrible generals, the ones that are closest to the Tsar, and then fight with what they have. And they needed them, and they did very well. And once they had enough time to build up their own, their own cadres, their own communist loyal military, then they purged the military in the early 1930s. That's when the whole, major, the general corps was core was purged and killed and so on. But basically what I think that should have been done is identifying the people who were the closest. I mean, this is a huge army, who were the closest to Saddam Hussein, get rid of them, get rid of the whole Republican Guard, because they were the ones really who were much more indebted to the regime. They were better paid, better equipped, and so on and so forth. And then I think this was the point where we would have been able to train and retrain, everybody from conscripts up. I mean, what did the Bundeswehr do after in 1989? They got rid of everybody over the rank of major, right? Well, we probably couldn't have done that, but this is something that you should have done. I mean, basically, it's not just the army who was dismissed, but the entire Ba'athist, the whole. The whole point is, you go to these East European countries, for instance, communist countries. Well, people became high school principals and so on and so forth, not because they wanted to be or they loved the regime. They had to, right? They had to be. I mean, how many people in the Chinese Communist Party today are really devout communists? They become, I would say 85% of the party members become party members because of various advantages, not loyalty as well. You could agree, you could argue, well, they don't really have spines. That's absolutely true, right? But that doesn't really make them useless. I think that there would have been a way to identify who are the people that we should have been really worried about, who are the ones with blood on their hands and so on, and who are the ones that we could work with. And maybe we could have or should have dismissed, half of the army or 100,000 of the army. But also, initially, we weren't even going to pay them anything. I mean, it's just so many of these young officers, it's for the livelihood of an entire family. All of a sudden, they're gone. I just really think it was stupid. So.
I'm really curious.
Please identify yourself.
Yeah. My name's Stephen. I'm very curious about what you would advise, and in our administration, in terms of their interaction and behavior and how we should support and not support the various regimes in the Middle East now.
Well, I think that a lot of mistakes were made. So, a lot of mistakes were made from the get-go in the Arab Spring. I think that throwing these dictators under the bus so quickly, people who basically did our bidding, I mean, Mubarak and Saleh in Yemen, I mean, he let us use all the drones we wanted to use, fight against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and so on and so forth. I think it was just wrong. I mean, to get rid of these people for a number of reasons. One of them is that it just gave the bad signal to all our allies. And, these are not the only sort of questionable characters that we are dealing with in the world, right? I think it's just, and also not seeing the alternative. Okay, so Mubarak will be gone, fine. Who else? I mean, I always thought that the most important principle of foreign policy was furthering your national interest, not building or promoting democracy, right? Especially in a place that, anyone can tell you that the chances of building democracy in some of these places were very, very small. And so how do we know that once democracy, let's just assume that there is democracy, right, in these places. Do you think that these people would necessarily be friendly towards the West if there was a real election? In Egypt, we had a real election, right? That was absolute. There's nothing really seriously wrong with the election that Morsi was elected by. Now, of course, he's a horrible guy, but the point is not Morsi. The point is, do we really want democracy, in Egypt, or do we want somebody who is doing what is favoring our policy? So, I really think that what we should try to hold up and push is American national interest, not democracy promotion. Democracy promotion is, I had lots of arguments about this with some of my colleagues, and who doesn't like democracy? But I think a lot of people are not really that interested in democracy in the Middle East, and there are lots of evidence to support this. When they are democracy, well, No, we want prosperity. We want stability. We want to be able to make sure that our kids will, have a decent life. So, I just think that we were way too quick to throw them under the bus, and I think that on this level, you have to make decisions in foreign policy that sometimes you have to go at it alone. In some of these military operations, for instance, sometimes you decide that you build coalitions and delegate some of the more difficult or more unseemly tasks to somebody else, and sometimes you simply have to hold your nose and turn your head and look away and do what needs to be done, and don't talk to a lot of journalists.
So, I'm Brandon.
Yes.
Walked you over here.
Yes, you did, and a great job you did too.
It was a difficult walk, but no, I kind of had a question specifically on Iraq. It seems that you kind of noted that Iraq and Syria are much more connected, kind of their fates are kind of connected in the sense of how we are approaching ISIS and how that's dealt with. But Iraq has the KRG in the north, and the KRG is becoming much more autonomous. So they recently kind of settled their oil issue just yesterday, I believe. But in the KRG, the younger generation, specifically my age and a bit older, don't recognize Iraq at all. I mean, they've never even been a part of Iraq. So how can a state, not only that has this very autonomous, very powerful, and relatively strong, but very democratic province, along with a very divided Sunni and Shia population, how can that continue to be? I mean, what does Iraq look like 10 years down the line if we assume that ISIS is somehow removed from Iraq? I mean, how can Iraq exist? It just seems that even if ISIS is removed, the fissures that have been created between those three groups are just so large that there's no possible way for those groups to come together under some pretend form of democracy. So I was just kind of curious.
No, it's a very good question. I'm sure that it engages a lot of foreign policy makers around the world. What should we do? And you're absolutely right with everything that you said. I think that there are a number of options, right? I mean, and just like we are not sure, and I think a lot of people are quite confident that Syria, the 2011 border of Syria will not be maintained. It's quite possible that Iraq's borders will not be maintained. Borders change all the time. Just remember the Crimea. So just recently. So it's not an ideal situation necessarily, but it could also turn into something that's far more positive. Self-determination and so on and so forth. And there might be ways, and I think that the most important issue here is economics and oil, right? And there might be some ways of paying off those who stand to be losing the most. But it is, it's a very complex question, and I don't think there is an answer. There are all kinds of different alternatives, and one might be less palatable than the other. But and of course for the Kurds there is a much larger issue with Turkey and so on and so forth. And if they would be allowed to determine their own fate, then the Turks would say something about that also. So I cannot give you any better answer than this, except that to say that you're right. It's a very sort of vexing issue.
Kind of as an additional aside to answer your question. Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Pennicor. I'm a senior here at SMU. And if I could go into linguistics, I would. I won't go into that.
Okay.
But my question is this perhaps on the less palatable side, at least for American audiences, looking at Iraq, are we maybe seeing a Saddamization of the central populations like Baghdad, where popularity for Saddam Hussein, I mean, while I was in Jordan, I saw posters praising him as kind of a martyr. So it definitely has a backing, despite kind of our long war. But my main question is that like a viable route that is really being explored by the Iraqi government?
Yeah. So Iraq is a very difficult place to hold together, right? And actually, I just heard this anecdote from Carl Eikenberry, who was our ambassador to Afghanistan, and he told me that when quote unquote we won the war, he called one of the main leaders of the military effort, John Abizade, who was his roommate at West Point. And he congratulated him. He was already the head of the American forces in Kabul, and he called John Abizade and said, "Well, good luck, friend. This is wonderful that you won." And John Abizade said, and I actually talked to Abizade, and he confirmed. And John Abizade is actually our only general who's a fluent Arabic speaker, and knows a great deal. Learned in Jordan. Comes from an old Lebanese Christian family. Anyway, so what Abizade said, practically verbatim, was, "This is now when we're going to find out why it took a son of a bitch like Saddam Hussein to keep this place together." Because he understood the complexity of keeping that place together with all the sectarians and the ethnic divisions and so on and so forth. And so what will be palatable for, I think that anything for the U.S. that's stable, that's sort of kind of trying to put things back together, and you have a state, even if it's a sort of an electoral authoritarianism like so many other of these countries, as long as we are not losing any more lives and don't have to send yet more troops back there, I think the American public, to the extent that they're interested at all, would be quite fine with that.
And a really brief
Sure.
aside as well.
Yeah.
Did you ever by chance teach Sierra Smith? I think that's her last name. She studies Arabic and public policy over at UT.
No. I would remember. I would remember Sierra probably.
Yeah. Hopefully she'll be in your.
It's not too tell Sierra. It's not too late.
Last one.
Hi, I'm Summer.
Hi.
I'm kind of doing research on this area right now. And so something you brought up is one of my questions is, you brought up how this hasn't always been a political radical Islam, and you pointed back to the Ottoman Empire when it was more peaceful. Do you think the origin of it becoming radical was when they split up the Ottoman Empire in 1919 and the West kind of came in and was like, okay, this is this state and this is this state? Like, where would you point to the origination?
I think that's quite possible. I mean, what you had under the Ottomans, like I said, it was generally speaking, a great deal of tolerance under the sort of umbrella, and the Ottomans would like to portray themselves as sort of this beneficial umbrella, and it was. The Ottoman Empire, if you study empires, had all kinds of problems with, perhaps lack of economic progress and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, it had these huge advantages that people, really didn't appreciate until it was over. Even though you studied, that once it broke up, there was a lot of messiness and, little genocides here and there and so on. But yeah, I think that it's quite possible, because these countries, especially if you read these, I'm blanking on the name of the English woman who was, I read this.
Gertrude Bell.
Yes, and her biography, and how the importance of these people, and how basically, just a few people sitting in London decided where these countries are going to be and where you're going to draw the borders, and it was inevitable to upset a lot of people, a lot of populations, and like a lot of countries or a lot of populations or regions that come from under an authoritarian place, right? Once they were in a majority, it was very easy for them to start and abusing the minorities, right? Or if they were able to get into a position of domination, such as the Alawites in Syria, right? It was a great deal more, willingness on their part to use, very brutal means of suppressing, population. So I'm sure it has something to do with the way that these countries came to life.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and now it's time to go back to studying and learning term papers. But before we do that, please join me.
Is this yours?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay.
So it's just a consent if you don't want it.
Oh, I know. I just signed.
Nice to meet you.